Hello and welcome to Public Affairs Today. I'm Alicia Callanan Mandigo. This is a show designed to introduce you to public affairs, which is a much more dynamic field than you may realize. On the table today is law enforcement and the use of force. With me today is Assistant Professor Ross Wolf from UCS Department of Criminal Justice and Legal Studies. Welcome and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Alicia.
Now, we're going to talk about law enforcement and the use of force, and that's something that makes a lot of headlines. In fact, we probably see a story at least once a month on some cop that went overboard somewhere. But you have been studying the exact opposite, and that would be the insufficient use of force in situations. Tell me about that.
Actually, we went into a research project that was funded by the National Institute of Justice and looked at how force was utilized in the field. We didn't go in with preconceived notions of actually looking at the less force, but what happened is we found by looking at the data and crunching the numbers, we found that police officers are actually today, with the two agencies that we looked at, using less force than would be legally justified. The issues surrounding that, of course, are that if a police officer uses more force, there's legal ramifications. There's the potential for not only court, but for citizens to have an outcry against what they've done. So, officers may be tending, for those reasons, to use less force than might be legally justified.
Okay, so you said that you made the reference, the cop of today. So is this an issue that's been studied before?
Well, it has been studied recently. There have been other people who have been looking at police use of force and looking at the levels of force within an encounter between a police officer and a citizen, because those are dynamic situations. It's not just, person does A, police officer does B, end of situation. There's a lot more to it than that. And recently, there have been some criminologists who've been looking at the dynamic interaction between the officer and the citizen and trying to determine what exactly is going on. There have been other studies that have found slightly less force being used by the officer recently, but our study really showed a significant amount of difference between the force an officer could use or was legally justified to use in a situation and the amount of force they did use.
Okay, so what's happening here? We know the big, jumping off point for all of this was Rodney King. We've had multiple incidents since then. So have incidents like that, are cops throttling back instinctively because they're worried about these things?
I think that a large majority, I can't give you a number, 99% of police officers are being very careful because they're aware of the litigious society that we have about getting sued, about being caught on camera doing something wrong, which police officers are out there wanting to do the right thing, most of them. And so I think that's true. Now, there are still people out there who are doing the wrong thing. And unfortunately, that's going to happen in any career. You're going to have some individual at some point doing something wrong. But I think that the police officers are looking at these same things that you and I are seeing on the internet, on the nightly news, where we see police officers overstepping their boundaries, and they're saying, "I don't want to be that person."
Oh, now it's even tougher because now people post stuff on YouTube.
Sure, YouTube, absolutely. There's recently some postings on YouTube showing officers doing things wrong that hit the news, and officers are saying, "I don't want to be that person. I don't want to overstep my boundary." And the result of that may be what we found in our study, that they're actually stepping back a little too far. The problem with stepping back too far sounds great on paper. We have police officers.
Kinder, gentler policemen.
Exactly. We have police officers that are doing the right thing as far as society says. Hey, they're being kinder, they're being gentler. But the problem is, what we also found in our study is that for the police officers that use less force in a situation, the confrontation went on longer. And when a confrontation goes on longer, there are more injuries that are encountered by both the officer and the citizen. So by using less force initially, the officer ends up either himself or herself getting hurt, or the citizen that's involved in the encounter gets hurt, or both.
So are there particular scenarios in which that's more likely to happen, for instance, if an officer is responding to a domestic dispute?
Sure, and this study didn't look at particular situations as what might be the factor for causing injuries or that might be more dangerous for officers, but other studies have, and certainly domestic violence situations are very dangerous for officers, but there are some that are even more dangerous, and citizens need to be aware that police officers are trained, and it's fact that police officers get hurt in traffic stops more than any other kind of confrontation, if you will, with a citizen, any contact with a citizen. And if an officer comes up and seems to be very officer safety, in other words, standing back behind the door, being very cautious with you when they're talking to you about your driver's license, and you're thinking to yourself, why is he treating me like this? I'm not a criminal. And I'm not saying being mean, but just being aware of their surroundings, overly cautious about where your hands are, let's say. It's because officers are trained, and studies show us that traffic confrontations are one of the things that are very dangerous for officers.
Yes, we've had actually here in Florida a number of highway patrolmen who they didn't even get to address the suspect. They were taken out almost as soon as they stepped out of their car.
Right. Yep. Well, you can read, every year at least, locally, we have police officers that are being injured in the line of duty, and a lot of times those are traffic related, whether it's something that's a little more highly dangerous, like putting out stop sticks, or if it's something where trying to arrest an individual who's in a car that they've made a traffic stop on. Those situations have become dangerous for law enforcement officers here in Central Florida. So, the issue becomes officers need to be aware of the dangerous level of traffic stops, and combining that with our recent study, the longer you allow a confrontation to continue, once a confrontation begins, it's more likely that someone's going to get hurt. So, we're looking at two factors there.
So if you could just kind of lay out a scenario for us, and maybe there's a traffic stop situation where you could kind of walk us through a scenario in which a cop didn't use the force they should have or were entitled to use in that situation, and how things went awry as a result.
Sure. Police officers mostly in the nation use a matrix to learn how to respond to a perceived level of force by a citizen, by a subject, how they should respond. This matrix has different levels that shows if a citizen does this, then the police officer is legally justified to do this response. And those levels, those force on that matrix are taken from reasonable standards that have been developed from case law, from constitutional case law. So an officer, let's say at a traffic stop, approaches an individual and finds out his driver's license is suspended. He asks the individual to step out of the car, and the individual does, complies. They're both at a very low level of force. The officer still is using a level of force which is called verbal commands, and the subject is complying, so they're at what would be level 1 on the use of force matrix. The individual then decides that he's not going to comply with the officer. So when the officer goes to put handcuffs on the individual to arrest him, say, for driving with a suspended license, the individual swings at the officer, which would be level 3, which is active physical resistance on the use of force, or even 4, depending on if he's got the handcuffs on, if it could cause the officer harm.
You can punch somebody with handcuffs on?
Well, if you had one handcuff on, let's say, and you're trying to punch them. So they're pretty high up there on the use of force. But the officer, instead of trying to react with that same level of force, because if you're at level 4, the officer could actually use chemical agents, taser, those kind of things. Instead of doing that, the officer tries to redirect the person back to the hood of the car where he's standing. That would be a much lower level. That would be a 3, could be a 2 even, depending on what's going on, how it's done. So the officer's reacting with a less amount of force. The individual starts to run, which is active physical resistance, again, level 4, starts to run away from the scene. The police officer then tries to tackle the individual, which would be a type of takedown, which is, again, level 3. Once he gets him to the ground, the individual tries to swing again, and the officer puts the handcuffs on, which is level 2 or level 3, depending on who's. And when I'm saying these levels, they're different for different agencies based on what they train. So that's why, I might say it's level 3, and an agency may actually say, well, that would be level 4 for us. But for this example, the officer is always using less force than they could have used based on what the subject did. So the officer ends up taking the person into custody, but the entire time has been 1 or 2 levels of force below what the individual was at during the resistance. This would create what we call a cumulative force factor deficit, where the officer is responding with less force over the entire conflict period. And we found this a lot in our study, that this was going on a lot. Initially, if the officer had used a taser, say, with the initial swing of the fist, if the officer had responded with a taser, which would have been at the same level as the active physical resistance, the situation might have been over. The individual may have had the electric shock, the 2 prongs in them, but they would have been handcuffed again and the situation would have been done. Where in this scenario that I gave, the individual could be hurt from being tackled, taken to the ground. The police officer could be hurt from getting hit with handcuffs that were swung on a hand, or could be hurt from just a punch in the face or punch wherever he got punched. So the injuries would accumulate also in this conflict.
Okay, so in this scenario, we're talking about a single officer. Now, did your study find that an officer is more likely to use insufficient force when he's alone? Because again, going back to the excessive force, those stories always seem to involve multiple officers.
Sure, they seem to, which unfortunately, we don't have cameras everywhere in our society. It would be great, I think, and most police officers would agree with this statement, it'd be great if every patrol car we had a camera that captured an incident. A lot of people feel that, that police officers do something wrong, but when it's reviewed on camera and these force matrices that I've talked about can be looked at, a lot of times the agency will say, no, the officer did exactly what is allowed by law and what we trained to do. So even though the person felt, hey, I shouldn't have been tased, or hey, I shouldn't have been sprayed, or the officer hit me with a baton and I don't think that should happen, the agency can look at it with the camera and say, well, it worked out fine. The other issue is that when there's another officer there, as you mentioned, sometimes the officer's story differs from the subject's story. So again, why a camera comes into, why most police officers say, I would rather have a camera there watching what I'm doing. What happens sometimes, though, as you mentioned, is that we have police officers that do get this mob mentality. When they see one person doing something, they respond in the same manner, and instead of thinking it through and determining whether or not they're at the right level of force and response. Again, that doesn't happen a lot, but what happens is, because it happens once here and once there and once on the West Coast, once on the East Coast, and we see that every night on our television, we tend to, as a society, think that this is going on a lot. Mm-hmm. It's not really happening as much as we think it is out there. When you look at the number of times that police officers come in contact with citizens, make arrests every day, most times there is no use of force in a police-citizen encounter, even if there's an arrest. And very few times is there anything that even results in any kind of physical force other than handcuffing. Less than 80% usually are anything other than handcuffing.
Has your study, though, found incidents of where multiple officers respond and then they still use insufficient force?
Well, we our data can show us that, but one of the things that we want to do is keep breaking down the data, and that would be a great thing to look at the number of officers that were there at each particular. But sometimes that's not said in a report. You may have 3 officers that go to a scene, and the main officer writes the report and talks about how the subject resisted, so this was done. And sometimes it's difficult in the use of force reports and the reports that, without going in and doing depositions, maybe a defense attorney has done depositions and we can look for that material. Sometimes it's difficult to determine how many officers were there. But that's one of the things we definitely can look at, is how many officers were at the scene when it happened. We have not looked at that in our study, though.
Great. Well, we're going to take a quick break, and we'll be back with Professor Ross Wolf, who is talking to us about police and the use of force. We're back with UCF Professor Ross Wolf, who is talking to us about police and the use of force. And I wanted to get into the subject of tasers. You and I had a previous conversation about tasers. There was a recent story about the New York Police Department making a change in policy. They had issued tasers when they were first available, but they were large and cumbersome, and so the police officers there had a tendency to keep the tasers in their trunks. They weren't very accessible. Now tasers are smaller and easier to handle, and so the police department in New York has decided that cops will now carry them on their tool belt, making them more accessible.
Right.
What are your thoughts on that?
Well, what New York has done, and in actuality, they're far behind the rest of the nation with the New York Police Department. But as was explained by their commissioner, when you have so many police officers, as the City of New York Police Department has, changing their course is like changing a battleship's course in the ocean. It takes a while to make a change. Most agencies in the United States have much less people on their forces, and most agencies within the United States have already put tasers out there where all police officers have them on their belt. What New York has done now is they've said, we're going to have our supervisors, our road sergeants carrying these tasers out there, and they're going to have them on their belt. I think it's a good move in the right direction, and I think that there might be some really good data that comes from what they do as well, how the tasers are utilized. One of the things that they were questioning is whether tasers should be used only as a less lethal option in a potentially deadly force situation. In other words, if someone has a weapon where they might normally use a gun to respond to that level of force, the police officer might use a gun in response, is they're hoping that a police officer will use a taser instead. One of the things that Taser is saying is that's not necessarily why our device is there, although it's great when that happens. Again, talking about our study, we found that there were 500 cases over the 5 years of data that we looked at from the 2 local agencies, that there were 500 cases where the subject had used potentially deadly force, either with a vehicle, a weapon of any kind, say a bat, which could be deadly, a 2x4, a shovel, which all in their hands could be deadly things, and a police officer may have been legally justified to use deadly force in those situations, actually responded with a taser instead, or some other less lethal option. So what New York is looking at is, are we going to be able to save lives by using the taser? I think, in response to what they're doing, I think they're going to find, maybe is the answer to that question, but more importantly, they're going to have less injuries to officers and subjects, because the conflicts are going to cut down in duration, and so the police officers and the subjects are going to have a much shorter conflict period where the police officer responds with a taser, the event's over, and the person is not injured except for the taser probe striking them and the taser shock, and handcuffs are on, and that's the end of the story. Are they going to save lives? I hope so. I hope that it shows that police officers use less lethal force when they could have potentially used deadly force, like our study shows. But again, even with our study, it's hard to look at, when you look at a use of force report or you look at an incident report, would the police officer have been totally justified to shoot the person? That's hard to determine. Were they justified in using a taser? Yes, but would they have been justified in using a gun? That would have been harder to determine.
But their position on how they want to use tasers is not in line with the scenario we just laid out with the traffic stop.
Yeah, they're saying instead of using your gun, try to use a taser instead. That's very different from what we're talking about. But again, they're trying to turn the tide of how things are done with the New York City Police Department, which is going to take them a while. So maybe they'll see the advantages of using the taser in other situations. Without having their patrol officers have tasers on their belt, it's very unlikely that they're going to have as much uses of the taser out there. But again, more officers might continue to get hurt if they don't have a weapon like that to rely on.
Now, one of the scenarios that they had laid out for the use of tasers was if you have a suspect or a person who is not mentally competent, and so those situations can get very dangerous, very drawn out. Those are situations where cops do pull guns, and they were using that as an example of here's where we would prefer to use a taser.
Sure. One of the limitations to that, though, again, is who's going to be the first responder on that scene. It's probably going to be the patrol officer who has a mentally ill person who may be doing something that might be perceived as deadly force resistance. You know, they might have a bat in their hand, they might be swinging a machete around, that the officer may say, this is deadly force, and legally might be justified to use a gun. But by not issuing the patrol officer that taser, they're taking away that option. The officer needs to resort to something else.
Or wait for the supervisor.
Or wait for the supervisor to get there, which could be deadly to an officer. If they're standing there waiting, if a guy's got a machete in his hand, and the officer's waiting for a supervisor to get there thinking, I don't want to shoot this guy, I want the taser to come out here. It could be a worse scenario than may have happened if he had just taken shots at the individual and stopped them right away. Now, I'm not saying that an officer should ever try to kill someone, but maybe that use of deadly force would stop them, and then aid could be rendered and get the person some help.
A number of people have publicly volunteered to be tased. There have been some reporters.
Sure.
Did Sheriff Berry get tased?
He did.
Yes,
Yes,
I
he
thought
did.
I thought I remembered that.
It was a couple years ago.
But you have not been tased.
No, that's right. Yeah.
Do you think, you're saying that maybe you might you're thinking about it. Do you think if you get tased that it would change your position on how tasers should be used?
No, the opportunity has been, there are a couple times when I've been in some training scenarios, but just have never had the full opportunity to take advantage of it. But I'm going to get tased. Now, is it going to change my opinion? I doubt it, because I know it's going to hurt. I know it's going to leave marks, and I know that I'm not going to want to ever have it done again. Those are the three things that everybody says that has been tased. Does that change my opinion on how the taser works? No. Now, I do want to point out that there are conflicting opinions, if you will, to mine. Amnesty International has come out and said that tasers should be banned from all police departments and should not be used until there's been more study in determining, because they see it as a form of torture.
Okay.
My opinion is 180 degrees from what they're saying, that it is a method for police officers to make an arrest without causing permanent physical damage to someone. They're saying it can cause permanent physical damage.
And there have been instances.
There have, and there have been instances where people have died after a taser has been used. And Amnesty International points to those and says, wait a minute, people are getting hurt by these. On the other hand, Taser looks at those and says, no, those people were on drugs or had certain heart problems anyway, and these people were on death's door to start with. So there is conflicting data on that. But my response to that is, if a police officer has the ability to use something that has a potential to be less than lethal, and to stop the person from doing what he's doing, rather than using a gun or rather than dragging out the confrontation, the officer should use it. The officer should be able to use it, should stop the confrontation when they can, and keep the person from hurting themselves, the officer, hurting other people, or getting hurt by a longer confrontation.
Explain to us what happens when a person gets tased. How long does it last? How much does it hurt? Doctors like for us to use the 1 to 10 scale.
Sure. Well, tasers hurt, and from the studies that I've participated in, and from talking to people who've been tased, it's a 10. On a scale of 1 to 10, it hurts more than anything they've ever felt before, and they want it to stop. It lasts about 5 seconds. The trigger pull on a police officer's taser, once the target darts are deployed and hit the target, there's a 5-second automatic cycle that the taser goes through.
Now the darts are like electronic prongs, right?
They're prongs. They have like a fish hook on the end of them.
Okay.
They're like straight fish hooks, basically, is what they are, and they're attached to a wire that's tethered to the device. There's 2 wires, and so you're getting that current going through. If a taser strikes the body, or actually near the body, it can even be in the clothing where it's not actually in the skin, the electric current can still transfer to the person. So once the darts hit the person, there's a transfer of electricity that goes through the body, and Taser has proprietary wavelengths that they use, that they claim for their device, that makes the person lock up, basically. They have static. Because of electricity, their neurons receive static, and there is no way for them to control their body. For law enforcement, that's important, because if a person has a machete in their hand and you tase them, they are not able to use that taser. It's not that they don't want to because of the pain, which could happen, that they just want to drop it because it hurts so much, but it's that they're not able to react at all because of the static in their system. They actually locks them up, and it is painful, but the benefit to law enforcement is there's no control over the body, and basically the person will fall. They can't control what they're doing, and they fall to the ground. Again, for law enforcement purposes, they're able to handcuff the individual. Sometimes it takes more than one shock. The person, after 5 seconds, the person tries to grab the machete again. And again, we're talking possibly mentally ill people who are on drugs, that they're just, heck, I'm going to keep trying. And so there has to be more than one shock. But what happens is, after a couple of shocks, law enforcement should see that, hey, this isn't working, let's try a different route, let's try to do something different. Or police officers are now being trained to move in on an individual while the shock is going on. It's okay for an officer to touch the person while the shock is going on. They won't. Well, they sometimes get what's called a bite, where if they touch between where the 2 darts hit the individual, if they touch between those 2, then there's going to be an electric current. Just like any electric current, it wants to find the shortest way out, and if you touch between them, it's going to find that method. But if you go on the outside of it, you're not the shortest way for it to end its, to ground itself, and so you're able to touch the person without being hurt at all. So police officers are actually being trained now to move in on an individual while the 5 seconds is going on, and handcuff them while the shock is going on. And sometimes, again, that's hard to do because the body will lock up. So it's really hard to get someone into handcuffs if the body's locked up, but at least they can get people on the arms and get the handcuffs ready to go in between shocks.
How do you feel about civilians having tasers?
It's a really fairly new thing. Taser, within the last year, has come out with these civilian models.
And they're fashion tasers too.
Right. They come in pink, they come in camouflage, they come in metallic blue, all these colors, and they actually are having taser parties instead of Tupperware parties, where people are demonstrating these in their home. I think it's a great personal defense, but the other side of me sees it as this also means that people who have ill intent might have tasers out there and use those as weapons as well. Taser's take on it is, if you look at their press releases on why they're releasing it to the civilian market, is as a self-defense tool. And again, if they say, even if it is used as a weapon, it's much better that this is being used than a gun in a situation. You can see all the problems that might occur from someone going into a pharmacy with a taser and zapping the clerk in order to take money or drugs. But with our society and the right to bear arms and all those things that we have in our society, maybe it is better that someone has a taser than a gun in those kind of situations, rather than killing the pharmacist, or whoever's behind the counter. They're going to be okay after. Now, the civilian model is a little bit different. The civilian model actually has a 15-second or 30-second delay on it, or shock cycle. And the reason for that is Taser wants the individual who uses it to shock their attacker, drop the weapon, and run.
Okay.
They don't want them to wait around. There's no handcuffing going
Right.
on. There's no control needed. And Taser has actually said that they'll replace the model if there's a police report that shows the individual did that. They'll give them another one for free. So it's more of a shock the person,
And
get
run
out
away.
of the way. Yep,
Okay.
get away. So it's the purpose behind it is a lot different than what the police model is.
Wow, that's interesting. Well, I'm afraid we're out of time, but hopefully you can join us again because
to.
there's a lot more to talk about.
Thank you, Lisa.
Again, this has been Professor Ross Wolf from the Department of Criminal Justice and Legal Studies at UCF. And that's going to do it for now. I'm Alicia Callanan Mandigo. Thanks for watching Public Affairs Today.